All right, everyone, get ready because today we are taking a deep dive into React Native development.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting stuff.
It is. You hear all this buzz about build once, deploy everywhere, but we're going to go beyond that hype. And we're really going to look at the real power of React Native.
Yeah, and how you can use it and use your existing web dev skills to build truly native apps.
Exactly. Using those technologies you might already be familiar with, JavaScript especially.
Hmm.
So to guide our exploration, we've got an awesome stack of sources here. We're going to be drawing from React Native for mobile development, learning React Native,
That's great choices.
and we'll even sprinkle in some little recipes from the React Native Cookbook.
Excellent. Yeah, those are all great resources, and they each bring a different perspective to React Native.
They really do. So get ready, because we're going to unravel the mysteries of something called the virtual DOM. We're going to explore what a React Native project looks like, the anatomy of it, and we'll even uncover how native bridging can unlock the full potential of your mobile device.
That's right. It's going to be a lot of fun. But it all begins with React, which is a wildly popular JavaScript framework that a lot of people use for web development. And React Native basically takes that same component-based approach that React uses and brings it into the mobile world.
So we're kind of like leveraging the power and the familiarity of React, but instead of rendering web elements, we're actually creating these native components.
Exactly.
That seems like a complete game changer for performance.
It is, yeah. And a big part of that performance gain comes from React Native's use of the virtual
It's the
DOM,
virtual DOM. Okay.
which it basically acts as a lightweight representation of the actual user interface.
Mm-hmm.
And it allows React Native to efficiently figure out what are the most efficient updates to make whenever something changes.
Oh, so it only changes what's absolutely necessary.
Right.
So that translates to a smoother, more responsive experience.
Yeah, that's right.
It eliminates that lag that can sometimes plague other types of apps, like web view-based apps.
Exactly. And it helps deliver that truly native experience.
Now, let's kind of shift gears for a second and peek under the hood. What does a typical React Native project look like? What's the layout? What's the structure?
Well, you'll generally see a structure that separates your platform-specific code from your core application logic. React Native for mobile development actually highlights this pretty well with their House Share project,
Oh, cool.
which, yeah, it's a great example of how these projects are structured.
So separate folders for iOS and Android code.
No.
But right alongside that is our JavaScript, which is really the heart of our application.
Exactly.
And the separation is super important, right?
Right.
Because it allows us to maintain and update our app for both platforms
Hmm.
without getting things all tangled up.
Yeah, it keeps things organized.
Now, we can't forget that Node Modules folder,
Mhm.
which is home to all those external libraries, all the tools that power our React Native projects.
Right, and all the dependencies we need to pull in. And then, of course, you have your main entry point, which is often a file named app.js, and that's where your application logic begins to take shape.
Speaking of application logic, let's talk about components, the building blocks of a React Native app. And learning React Native really emphasizes how important these components are. It's all about breaking down the UI into these independent, reusable chunks, right?
Yeah, precisely. Like, for example, they have the message component example, which neatly encapsulates both the visual structure and the JavaScript logic that brings that component to life.
So it's basically like we've got the visuals and we've got the brains all in one little package.
Yeah, and that visual structure is written in something called JSX, which is really cool.
Wait, JSX, I've heard that term. Can you unpack that a little bit?
So JSX, it's basically a syntax extension to JavaScript that allows you to write HTML-like code, but right within your JavaScript files.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it might seem a little odd at first, but it actually makes creating these UI components a lot more intuitive.
Oh, I see. So it's like a bridge between JavaScript and the visual structure of our app.
Exactly.
But how do these components become dynamic? How do they actually interact with the user? I keep hearing about these things called props and state.
Right, so props and state are super important for creating a truly engaging user experience. You can think of props as external inputs to a component. They allow you to customize the appearance of the component or even its behavior.
So props are like settings or parameters that we pass to a component.
Exactly, yeah, like configuration options. And then state, on the other hand, that lives within the component itself, and it's all about managing data that can change over time.
Okay, so if we had like a counter component, the current count would be part of the state. And clicking a button to increase the count would trigger a change in the state.
Exactly, and React would then re-render that component to show the updated count.
This is starting to click now. We've got our components communicating with each other, responding to actions, all that good stuff. But what happens when things inevitably go wrong? How do we debug a React Native app? I know React Native for mobile development mentions Chrome's developer tools, which is great news for web developers like me.
That's right. You can use those same familiar tools you use for web development to debug your React Native apps.
Oh, fantastic.
And you can inspect the code, track down errors, even monitor performance. And then there's this great extension called React Developer Tools, which allows you to visualize the component hierarchy and see what's going on.
It's like having X-ray vision into our app.
Yeah, exactly. You can see the props and state of each component.
Very cool.
And then there's live reload, so you can see the changes you make in your code reflected instantly in the simulator.
Well, very nice. That's always helpful. So we've got our components, we can debug them. But how do we actually stitch all of this together to create a seamless experience for our users? How do we move between different parts of our app? And learning React Native, I remember they use the iOS Settings app as an example for navigation.
Right, and the key takeaway from the Settings app is that navigation in React Native. It mimics a stack-based approach, similar to how a web browser works.
Oh, a stack of screens?
Yeah, so as the user goes deeper into the app, screens get pushed onto that stack, and when they go back, screens get popped off.
So it's all about managing the flow of screens and ensuring that those transitions are smooth and intuitive.
Exactly.
And React Native gives us tools for this, right?
It does, yeah. There's the navigator component, which allows us to define how screens are pushed and popped.
Okay, so we've got all the structural stuff down. Components, debugging, navigation. But what about aesthetics? How do we style our app to make it visually appealing? I noticed that React Native for mobile development mentions styles that look a lot like CSS.
You're right, yeah. React Native styling utilizes JavaScript objects that mimic CSS properties. So if you're familiar with CSS, you'll feel right at home styling React Native components.
That's a huge plus. And then there's Flexbox, which I keep hearing is super important for responsive design.
It is, yeah. Flexbox is really powerful. It gives you precise control over how components are positioned and laid out within the app.
Okay, so things are starting to make sense.
Okay.
We've got our structure, we can style it. But here's where things get really interesting for me. Accessing the native capabilities of the device. We're talking camera, GPS, all that good stuff. I remember reading about this concept of native bridging. What's the deal with that?
So native bridging allows you to tap into those device-specific functionalities that aren't readily available in React Native's core APIs.
So essentially, we can build bridges between our JavaScript code and the native code of the platform.
Yeah, exactly, whether that's iOS or Android.
So for example, if we wanted to use a feature that wasn't part of React Native's standard library, we could write some native code and then expose those functions to our JavaScript code through this bridge.
Exactly.
That is really powerful. It's like having the best of both worlds.
It is.
The flexibility of JavaScript with the access to native capabilities, and React Native for mobile development walks through an example, a counterexample, showing us the process.
Yeah, it's a great way to get your head around how native bridging works.
Very cool. Okay, so now we have the power to really extend React Native. We can tap into those native features. But before we unleash our app to the world, we got to make sure it's rock solid. Testing, that's such a crucial part of the development process, right?
Absolutely. And React Native for mobile development dives into testing using a popular framework called Jest.
I've heard a lot about Jest, good things. And from what I understand, there are two main types of testing. We've got unit testing and integration testing.
Right.
Can you break those down a little bit?
So unit testing focuses on verifying the functionality of individual components in isolation, whereas integration testing checks how those different parts of the app actually work together.
Oh, okay. So unit testing is like making sure each ingredient is perfect. And integration testing is making sure the whole dish comes together harmoniously.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
That makes sense.
And then there's also something called snapshot testing, which is unique to React, where you basically take a snapshot of your UI structure and compare it against a reference snapshot.
So if something's changed unexpectedly, the test will fail.
Exactly. It's a good way to catch unintended visual changes.
Like a visual regression test.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty neat.
So with that, we've laid a really solid foundation for React Native development. We've looked at the core building blocks, components, styling, navigation, testing.
And it's clear that React Native is a powerful framework. But it's also part of this much larger ecosystem. And I'm really curious to explore the world of third-party libraries and how they can help us make our lives as developers a little bit easier.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive into that vast and ever-evolving world of React Native libraries and tools.
Okay, so we're back and ready to dive into this huge ecosystem of third-party libraries that surround React Native. And React Native Cookbook, it really seems like a treasure trove of practical solutions,
Oh yeah, it's a great resource, a lot of practical stuff in there.
like a collection of recipes for common challenges. Let's start with something visually appealing, animations. And React Native for mobile development, they mention Lottie. I've heard good things.
Yeah, specifically, it's Lottie React Native. It's really great for bringing those intricate animations that designers create in After Effects and bringing them right into your React Native app.
So instead of having to code all those animations by hand, we can just leverage the work that designers are already doing.
Yeah, exactly. They export the animations as JSON files. You just import them into your React Native project using Lottie React Native, and you're good to go.
That's awesome. It's a huge time saver. Keeps the design and development workflow much more streamlined.
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of visual elements, icons, every app needs icons.
Mhm.
Are there any libraries that kind of simplify the process of working with icons in React Native?
Yeah, there are a bunch, but a really popular one is React Native Vector Icons. It gives you access to a ton of different icon sets like Font Awesome, Ionicons, Material Icons, all the popular
So I
ones.
could just grab an icon from one of those sets and just drop it right into my app.
Yeah, pretty much. You just import the icon component and use it like any other React Native component.
That's awesome. Super convenient. Okay, so we've got animations, icons, we're looking good. But let's shift gears a little bit and talk about something a little more conceptual, state management.
Yeah.
React Native for mobile development. I know they talk about Flux and Redux, these terms that kind of get thrown around a lot in the React Native world.
Yeah, they're important concepts, especially when you're building more complex applications. So Flux is basically a design pattern, a way of thinking about data flow in your app.
Okay.
It advocates for a unidirectional data flow, which means that data flows in one direction.
Oh, okay.
And it makes it a lot easier to reason about how changes in one part of the app are going to affect other parts.
Like a one-way street for our data.
Exactly, yeah. And Redux builds on top of that, provides a concrete library for managing your application state.
And the book also mentions actions.
Right.
What role do they play in this whole Redux world?
So you can think of actions as events or commands that trigger changes in your app's state. They're basically just plain old JavaScript objects that describe something that happened.
So if a user taps a button to like a post, that would be an action.
Exactly. And then Redux has this central store where the entire application state is held. When an action occurs, it's dispatched to this store, and the store then updates the state based on that action.
So the store is like the single source of truth for our data.
Yeah, exactly.
But how does Redux actually know how to update the state? I mean, how does it know what to do in response to an action? So that's where reducers come in. Reducers are basically just functions that take the current state and an action as input, and then they return a new state based on that action.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of like a set of rules for how the state should change.
So we've got actions that describe what happened. We've got the store that holds the state.
Yeah.
And we've got reducers that determine how the state should change. But why go through all this trouble? What are the benefits of using Redux?
Well, Redux brings predictability, structure, and testability to your state management. It might seem like an extra layer at first, but as your application grows, you really start to appreciate the clarity it brings.
Makes it easier to debug and test.
Yeah, absolutely.
But is Redux the only option? I'm sure React Native Cookbook has some other tricks up its sleeve for state management.
Oh yeah, React Native Cookbook highlights a lot of different approaches, like MobX, which takes a more reactive approach to state management. It's really about finding what works best for your specific needs.
And having options is always good. Now, let's talk about data persistence. What happens when a user closes our app? Do we just lose all that data? I remember React Native for mobile development mentioned something called async storage.
Yeah, async storage lets you store data locally on the device, so even if the app closes, the data is still there when they reopen it.
Okay.
And actually, React Native Cookbook has a great recipe for integrating Redux with async storage, using a library called Redux Persist.
So with Redux Persist, we can basically save and load our Redux state automatically.
Huh.
So users don't have to start from scratch every time they open the app.
Yeah, exactly. It creates a much more seamless experience.
That's a big win for user experience.
And while we're talking about Redux, React Native Cookbook also introduces this tool called Redux Logger, which is really helpful during development.
Redux Logger, what's so great about that?
Well, imagine you could see a log of every action that's dispatched in your app and every state change that occurs. Redux Logger basically gives you that visibility, makes it much easier to understand how your app is working.
That's got to be super helpful for debugging.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so now we can debug, we can manage our state, we can persist data. What about working with the device's file system? I know React Native Cookbook has a whole section on that.
It does, yeah. Working with files and directories is a pretty common task in mobile app development.
Whether we're handling downloaded files or user-generated content or caching data offline.
Right, and React Native Cookbook has some great recipes for those common file system tasks. Using a library called React Native DAFs,
React Native DAS, what can we do with that?
you can do all sorts of things, like write data to a file, read the contents of a directory, check if a file exists, delete files, pretty much anything you need to do with the file system.
That's awesome. Gives us a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, but you do have to be mindful of security, especially on platforms like iOS. You don't want to accidentally expose sensitive user data.
Yeah, security is always a top priority. Okay, so we built our app, we've tested it, it can even handle files. But now comes the big step, deployment, getting our app into the app stores. And React Native Cookbook mentions a tool called Fastlane. I'm really curious about this one.
Yeah, Fastlane's really cool. It automates a lot of the tedious and repetitive tasks involved in deploying mobile apps.
You mean like dealing with certificates, provisioning profiles, all that fun stuff?
Yeah, exactly. All those things, it can be a real headache. Fastlane basically handles it for you, makes the process a lot smoother.
Nice. And React Native Cookbook walks through setting up Fastlane for both iOS and Android, right?
It does, yeah. It shows you how to create lanes, which are basically sets of automated actions that you can trigger with a single command.
So like we could have a beta lane that builds our app, increments the build number, and then uploads it to test flight.
Exactly. It takes care of all those steps for you.
That's awesome. Automation is key. Now, React Native Cookbook also mentions something called configuring application settings. What's that all about?
So application settings are basically just environment-specific configurations. You might have different settings for development, staging, and production.
Oh, okay. So things like API endpoints, feature flags, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So we can basically tailor our app's behavior to the specific environment.
Right.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, let's talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, code quality. React Native Cookbook has a section on maintaining coding standards with ESLint.
Oh, yeah. ESLint's a great tool. It's basically a code linter that helps you enforce a consistent coding style and catch potential errors.
So it's like having a very strict code reviewer.
Yeah, exactly.
Always checking our work.
And React Native Cookbook recommends using a configuration inspired by the Airbnb style guide, which is very popular and comprehensive.
Consistent coding style is so important, especially when you're working on a team.
For sure, makes the code base much easier to read and understand.
Now, React Native Cookbook throws in this really interesting twist. Writing your app with something called reason. Is that even possible?
Yeah. It is, yeah. Reason's a really interesting language. It's built on top of OCaml, which is a powerful functional programming language.
A whole new language. This is getting pretty advanced.
Yeah, but Reason advocates for type safety, which can really help prevent bugs, especially in larger projects.
Type safety.
Yeah, it means that the compiler will catch certain types of errors before you even run your code.
Oh, so it's like an extra layer of protection.
Exactly.
But how easy is it to use Reason with React Native?
Well, React Native Cookbook walks through setting up Reason React, which is a framework that bridges the gap between Reason and React Native. It might seem daunting at first, but it can really pay off in the long run.
So Reason React basically opens up a whole new dimension for React Native development.
Yeah, it's a different way of thinking about building React Native apps.
This is a lot to process, but it's exciting. It seems like React Native is so much more than just a framework.
It is. It's a whole ecosystem constantly evolving.
Tons of tools, techniques, even alternative languages.
Yeah, and we've only just scratched the surface.
So much to explore. It's amazing. But let's take a step back for a second and reflect on what we've covered so far.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
We started with the fundamentals of components and styling. We talked about state management, native bridging. We even ventured into the world of testing, deployment, alternative languages.
It's been a lot.
And all along the way, we've had these incredible guides. React Native for mobile development, Learning React Native, React Native Cookbook.
They're great resources full of insights and practical tips.
It really challenged us to think differently about mobile app development.
And the journey doesn't end here.
That's right. There's a whole community out there, a ton of resources, always something new to learn.
Absolutely.
So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll explore some of the best ways to stay connected, stay informed, and continue our React Native adventures. All right, we're back, and now it's time to talk about how to stay connected with the React Native community. And, keep learning and keep growing as React Native developers.
Yeah, it's super important to stay up to date because things are constantly changing in this space.
They really are. And React Native for mobile development, they actually point us towards some great starting points. They highlight the importance of the React Native repository on GitHub.
Yeah, GitHub's a great resource.
It's like the central hub for everything.
It is.
Source code, documentation, discussions. You can even see what's coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, you can get involved in the community, report issues, contribute to the project.
Very cool. And then for those like day-to-day questions that pop up, Stack Overflow, it's a lifesaver.
Oh yeah, Stack Overflow is essential.
It's like having access to, thousands of developers, all their knowledge, right there at your fingertips.
It's amazing how often you can find the exact answer to your question on Stack Overflow.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's pretty credible. But sometimes you need more than just a quick answer, right? Sometimes you need to connect with other developers, share experiences, learn from each other. That's where communities come in.
Yeah, and the React Native community is super welcoming.
It is. Lots of different ways to get involved.
There are Facebook groups, Slack channels, Discord servers, even in-person meetups.
Yeah, find what works for you.
Exactly. It's great to be able to, connect with like-minded people, ask questions, share your struggles.
Yeah, and you learn so much from other people's experiences.
You really do. But what if you want to dive deep into a specific aspect of React Native? Like, let's say animations or state management. Are there resources for that?
Oh, yeah. Tons of resources out there.
React Native for mobile development mentions blogs, tutorials, online courses, video series.
Yeah, there's something for everyone.
I feel like we're talking about a never-ending buffet of knowledge here.
It really is.
But with so many choices, it can be overwhelming.
It can be, yeah.
How do you recommend someone prioritize their learning?
Well, I always recommend starting with the official React Native documentation. It's a great foundation. It's really comprehensive.
And React Native for mobile development actually has a great chapter on setting up your development environment. Oh, yeah, that's super important.
Which can be a big hurdle for people new to React Native.
It can be, but that chapter walks you through it step by step.
Very cool. And once you have the basics down, React Native Cookbook is there to help you with more specific challenges.
Yeah, it's a great resource for learning by doing.
Like having a mentor right there with you.
And don't underestimate the value of just building stuff, getting your hands dirty.
Exactly.
Experiment, try different libraries, even contribute to open source projects.
It's all part of the journey.
It is.
The challenges, the triumphs, it's all part of learning.
And who knows, maybe one day you'll be the one sharing your knowledge and helping others learn.
Oh, that'll be awesome.
It's a great community to be a part of.
It really is. Well, it seems like we've reached the end of our deep dive into React Native. We've explored the core concepts. We've seen the vast ecosystem of libraries and tools.
We even touched on some advanced techniques and alternative languages.
We really covered a lot of ground. From setting up your development environment to deploying your app to the world.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
But I think most importantly, I hope we've inspired you to keep exploring, keep experimenting, and really see what's possible with React Native.
Yeah, because there's a lot you can do with it.
It's an incredibly powerful and exciting platform.
It is.
And it's only getting better.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, happy coding, everyone.